This is my new Revel Rail 29. I just got finished riding it for the first long ride that I've put on it, and I've got some observations that I think will help people who are considering a Revel bike or another bike that has the CBF suspension platform. So there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown around when people are talking about frame kinematics and suspension layouts and everything on mountain bikes, and most of it is either thinly veiled BS or, at best, confusing enough that the average person can't really make out what's going on. So instead of talking about the technical details here, because plenty of people have already done that, including Revel and Canfield themselves, I'm just going to talk about what it actually means to ride this thing. Now, I don't think companies do this. It's probably not intentional, misleading people or making up enough technical terms to turn anybody sideways. It's certainly not insidious, but I think it just happens all the time because there are a few nerds out there who understand linkages, kinematics of the frame, all of the terminology that goes into this. And so all of that speak is designed for those people, because those companies want to be as accurate as possible, but the average person just gets lost in the weeds. So they'll talk about anti-squat, anti-rise. On this particular design, there's a lot of discussion about instant center and controlling factors that play into that, so that blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, what you need to know about CBF is that both Canfield and Revel have put a lot of time into this bike to make sure that the normal forces that you're putting into your bike when you ride it don't negatively impact how the suspension performs. There's two big ones. There is pedaling forces and braking forces. Those are acting on the rear wheel, different times obviously, and those tend to do different things that are not good for the bike. So if you're pedaling, and some frames are designed this way, some frames are designed specifically not this way, some frames don't really take it into consideration all that much at all, but if you're pedaling, then it can essentially keep the rear suspension from moving. And where it does that, when it does that, how aggressively it does that is all determined by the specific suspension layout and the shock that you're running, even chainring size, all that stuff. At the end of the day, pedaling shouldn't impact how your suspension works if it's a perfect system. No real true perfect system exists. So the frame designers have gone at it to try and do their best to minimize those impacts. Same thing with braking. If I lock up the rear brakes on this bike, I still want my suspension to work. And some frames are worse than others where that doesn't really happen. So on a trail, what can you expect out of CBF or another platform that works like it or is aiming to do the same things? You can expect that when you're pedaling hard through really rough roots and rocks, that the suspension is still working and not locking up. You can also expect that when you're on the brakes, again, the suspension is still working. When you have a bad frame, what that will manifest as is, let's take braking for example, going down a fast section that's really rough and rooted out. How that will manifest on a poorly designed suspension frame is when you grab the rear brakes, the bike will feel almost like it's pulling back on the rider. And it's because it's getting hung up and it's not being allowed to work over that rough stuff. What I have noticed after riding this bike is that CBF, I'll say in general, but definitely on this frame, on this design, does an incredible job of eliminating those negative effects or minimizing them to the greatest degree. This bike has this weird feeling almost where you ride over rough stuff and it almost doesn't feel like you're pedaling in the same way that some frames do. It's not free, certainly it's not easy. It doesn't take any less energy probably to get through a course or up a trail, but it's got a very different, distinct feel, and it's great. Like it really handles well. An observation about this bike in general is that on a similar loop that I do frequently, and I just did a week prior to this on a bike probably 8 pounds lighter with much faster tires, this thing felt incredibly slow, but it actually wasn't. So if I look back at the time that it took me to do that lap, I was about 10 minutes longer on a 2.5 hour, roughly, lap on this bike. And all things considered, that's probably mostly down to tires and overall weight. These tires are much more aggressive than the other bike that I was on. And I think that says a lot about the suspension of this bike. It feels slow, and you're still kind of going faster than you expect. Now, something to say about that is that that might determine which bike in the Revel range you pick. The Rail honestly kind of made that trail that I was riding a little bit boring compared to some other bikes that go around it just fine. I would say that overall, rear suspension on a Revel bike based on this design has a tendency to ride like a bigger bike than the numbers suggest. And certainly it's not as big of a difference if you're just hucking off of a jump and landing it big onto the flat. That's going to be kind of similar across suspension platforms and stuff. But if you're just trail riding, I would guess that their bikes are going to feel like they have a little bit more rear travel than what you're used to if it's not CBF suspension. So it could be a bad thing. It might not be the most engaging ride ever. And so if you're on maybe tamer trails or mild trails that you really want the bike to feel like it's rocking around and giving you a lot of trail feedback, that's probably not a great characteristic of these frames. They just smooth it out too much probably. But if this is what you're after, then it does an incredible job of it. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if it's really worth diving into all the technical details because frankly, I know shocks and forks and suspension internals, but even as someone who works on that stuff all the time, this can be kind of voodoo unless you map it out with programs and you look at the curves, and even then you can get lost in the weeds with just not really understanding what that's going to feel like on the trail. So as a summary, forget about how this is doing it and just know that what it's doing on the trail is it's allowing the suspension to work. Doesn't so much matter what's going on, whether you're pedaling, whether you're on the brakes, whether you're going fast or slow. If it's a rough area, the suspension is going to be working better on this design than on some designs. There you have it. Revel Rail 29, CBF suspension, pretty awesome stuff.